Well, now we'll get on with the business at hand, and I really appreciate everyone sticking with us while we did a tableside service. That was important for our event this evening. And the Clarke Prize consists of a medallion and a $50,000 award established in the honor of Miss Athalie Richardson Irvine Clarke, who is an Orange County philanthropist and who also co-founded NWRI. The purpose of the Clarke Prize is to recognize scientists and engineers who best exemplify Ms. Clarke's dedication to finding solutions to the nation's water challenges. And this is very complicated and diligent work. Since the Clarke Prize was first awarded in 1994, it has built a reputation as one of the most prestigious awards in the water industry. To give you a sense of the contribution of the Clarke Prize laureates over the last 25 years in terms of advancing the availability of clean and healthy water, consider the following. Their groundbreaking research has directly contributed to addressing critical needs in the global water industry, such as quality and composition of safe drinking water, advancements in treatment technologies, and sustainable water supplies. Many of our recipients have used the award to fund support for water science education by donating their awards to science and engineering programs or scholarships at educational institutions all across the nation. Distinguished leaders, and we saw a lot of this evening if you looked out at the number of recognitions for Dr. Haas. Many leaders, including members of Congress and governors, senators, presidents, have noted the significance of the Clarke Prize laureates' research efforts and their accomplishments of the past prize winners. So in recognition of these contributions to society, please join me in welcoming each of our past Clarke Prize laureates who are in attendance this evening. And I'm going to go at this list, I hope, correctly and by time order. So first, here from Stanford University is Perry McCarty. Perry? Joan Rose is here from Michigan State. Vernon Snoyink from the University of Illinois. Manny Elamenek from Yale University. James Barnard from Black and Veatch. Here you go. And Mark Sobsey from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so tonight, before we present Dr. Haas as a 2017 Clarke Prize laureate, I'd like to take a moment to introduce James Irvine Swinden, who's going to take a few moments to provide some important context about the Clarke Prize and its visionary founders. Mr. Swinden is one of the founders of the Irvine Museum, which houses an incredible variety of art from the California Impressionist movement. One that really, he was kind enough to give me a tour one day. And if you haven't had a chance to go to the Irvine Museum, I really encourage you to go. In fact, we talked about this at dinner tonight. There's a painting there called Moonlight Marsh. And it speaks to you not only from a beauty and aesthetic standpoint, but also speaks to the environmental concerns of the world in terms of the way that the painting spotlights the wetland. And so, in assembling this collection of art and founding his museum, Mr. Swinden has been dedicated to the preservation and the display of this California Impressionist art. And this covers a period from like 1890 to 1930. Did I get that right? And the museum's played a principal role in the furtherance of this important variant on Impressionism. And I really encourage you to, if you haven't been over to the museum, it's located at 18881 Von Karman Avenue. I got that address right. And I'll tell you, if you haven't gone over there, it's an amazing place. I'm not really a big art guy, but if you have any inclination to these sorts of events, I'm telling you, it is an amazing resource. So do please go by there. And I think it's also important to note that last November the museum announced the transfer of the entire collection to the University of California at Irvine, and that's going to create an opportunity for the university to continue its path toward becoming one of the premier universities on a global scale at UCI. So thank you for that. And ladies and gentlemen, James Irvine Swinden.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, I thought this evening that we'd do a little tutorial about the award that you're receiving tonight. Most people in the room know about my mother, Joan Irvine Smith, and what she's done in the county, particularly for the university and water research and medical research, and also on a national level in terms of foundation reform. But a lot of people don't know about her mother. And her mother was an incredible woman. She was the grande dame of Orange County, and in many ways worked behind the scenes and enabled my mother to carry on what she was interested in. But I thought that I'd just share with you a little bit about this incredible woman and why this important prize is named after her. And so my grandmother was born by George Richardson and Carla Richardson, and he was a physician actually in Pasadena. He worked for the Huntington Hotel, but he also made house calls. And in 1903, she was born in Los Angeles. She had a sister who is now actually predeceased her, unfortunately. But Jean and my grandmother lived in the area around what is now USC. That picture over 1914. What my grandmother really wanted to do, she wanted to be a nurse, and partly because of her father being a doctor. And so she would actually go on his house calls in the buggy. And in Pasadena, one of her treats was that if she went on these house calls, he would actually take her out to the poppy fields. And so that encouraged her to actually think about art as also another alternative. This is her on Venice Beach. So in around 1921, she applied to the Osa Institute of Art, and she took her portfolio in. And at the end of the interview, they asked her when she could start. And she says, well, when do classes start? And she says, no, we're hiring you as a teacher. And a little later on, she actually met my grandfather, no resemblance to me at all. And he had a movie magazine that was helping to promote the movies, particularly in South America, called Cinelandia. And she ended up doing a lot of the covers for these, the movie magazine that was distributed around South America. And these are some of her earlier works. And in 1929, she married my grandfather. And just a short story is that just before she walked down the aisle, her father told her, Athalie, your life is going to change today. You're going to have the opportunity to affect a great number of people in significant ways. Don't let that change you. And I think she took that at heart. And throughout her life, she constantly was at the forefront of different, during her lifetime, she supported over 10 different medical institutions, and also USC, and obviously was involved in the UCI. This is their honeymoon in Hawaii. In those days, of course, you had a long honeymoon. You took a ship over there and you got to go for 3 months. When they were on the big island of Hawaii, they actually went up to the volcano house, and they sent the driver back to Hilo. Hilo's quite a ways away from the volcano house, and that was the night the volcano erupted. And so, since they had nowhere to go, they actually sat on the side of the crater and watched the eruption. Ultimately, she came back and she lived at the ranch house, which was actually only about a couple miles away from here. My grandfather at that point was being groomed to take over the operations of the Irvine Ranch. Unfortunately, as a child, he contracted tuberculosis. And so his life expectancy was to be about mid-40s, and that's approximately when he passed away. But I think her first inkling of agriculture developed having been on the ranch for that period of time. And from that, she understood ranching. She particularly understood the value of water. So the story kind of on our family is that the Irvine Ranch drilled about 1,000 wells. Bixby drilled about 6 of them, except he hit oil. I mean, he's 5 miles away. What's fair about that? But they understood about water. And it was my grandfather and great-grandfather who developed Irvine Lake as a reservoir in order to supply the water they would need for their crops. And in many ways, they were just really ahead of their day. This is down at the family cove. And then my mother was born in 1933. This was both a joyous occasion, but also a very difficult occasion for my grandmother, because her husband had tuberculosis, and she had to make a decision whether to take care of her child or take care of her husband, because she couldn't do both. And so she actually gave her daughter to her parents to take care of for the 2 years in which my grandfather died. And so she went to take care of her husband at that point in time. This is my mother about a year later. And then they lived in Oakhurst and Drive in Beverly Hills. If you know my mother, if you look at the curls in her hair, she hated that. She was definitely a tomboy. It was shortly after this, at the beginning of the war, that rationing came into effect. And my mother used to go down to visit her grandfather at the Irvine Ranch, but when gasoline rationing came in, that became a problem. So in order for my mother to be able to have a horse and be able to ride, my grandmother bought a piece of land out in the valley. Well, my great-grandfather had a total fit over this, said it's worthless, nothing will ever take place of that, you're throwing your money away. And of course it became the cornerstone of one of the great malls out in the San Bernardino Valley. She had a great way of being able to parlay her real estate investment, which had nothing to do with the Irvine side. On one of the trips to the ranch, my mother was out riding and happened to come upon this coyote that had been caught in the mother had been caught in the barbed wire, and there were about 3 pups, and 2 of them were dead and one was alive. So my mother persuaded her grandfather to give her to the coyote. Well, she brought it back to Beverly Hills, and it lived at the house there with them, and this is a picture of it. So the first day after the coyote arrived, my mother was, had to go to school, which she didn't want to do. And when she came back, she found her mother in bed feeding the coyote with a baby bottle. After my grandfather died, my grandmother continued her publication of the movie magazine, and this was the first award that was given to Betty Davis, and of course you can recognize a number of the other people in the picture. Shortly after that, and after the war, she met Thurman Clarke, who ultimately became her third husband. And the judge always said that they had gone to school together and they were high school sweethearts. That's not totally true. But they were married during the war, and my grandmother kept up her activities as far as her own investments, her activities with the ranch. And then in 1952, she actually became very political. And she ended up being a delegate to 3 Republican conventions. She also served on the Eisenhower campaign. And then in 1964, she and my mother came up with the idea about having a university come to the Irvine property. It originally was not supposed to come here. And they fought very hard to get it here, but the company was definitely against it. And they were totally against where it was going to be placed, because originally it was supposed to be placed, if you're familiar, in Corona del Mar, next to Newport Beach. In other words, it was going to mimic San Diego and Santa Barbara having a campus right on the coast looking over the ocean. Well, the company, they played hardball. One night, they made a deal with a cemetery. They dug up pauper graves in Santa Ana, transported them to Corona del Mar, and put it into desecrated the site, in which case then the university could not be put there. As it turned out, it probably worked out fine because it actually got put into an area where it was a larger circumference of 360 degrees. This is a dedication that Lyndon Johnson came at. I think this was actually I don't know if he was so much interested in our little university out here, but he was definitely interested in the educational process and his legislative agenda at the time. Actually, going back to the university, Governor Brown Sr. Was once questioned why in the world he actually created universities at UCI and Riverside, and he said, well, those are the two counties that didn't vote for me, so those people obviously need to be educated. So when Ronald Reagan was president, my grandmother served on the state agricultural board for a number of years. One of her best friends was Richard Nixon. He actually wrote his second inaugural address at her home in Corona del Mar here, and she was asked to be on the preservation of the White House. And so she actually served under Nixon, she served under Ford, she also served under Jimmy Carter. That was kind of a big deal because these are political appointments, and typically everything is swept out. Her only regret was that when Reagan came in, Nancy swept everybody else out. So in 1987, she was awarded the university's highest award, which is the gold medal. This is a picture taken down at the Oaks, which was an event that my mother put on for a number of years, a show jumping event. This is Walter Henry, who at that point in time was the dean of the medical school. And then one of her great friends was Dr. Howard House. And Howard always wanted to marry her. He was about 10 years younger than my grandmother. And my grandmother kind of kept putting him off and off. And finally Howard said, well, I don't understand, Athalie. We have such fun. We like all the same things. We travel. We do all things together. And, this would be a wonderful relationship. And she looked at Howard and said, Howard, if we get married, all that funding from all those widows is going to dry up. Then in 1993, she passed away, and a year later, my mother decided to create this award in her honor, and it's going on now, 24 years, something like that. And so this is an earlier picture with Ron Linsky and Piers Swan and Dr. Rittman. Ron Linsky was the first director of the Institute, and Ron really shared the vision that my mother had in terms of being able to create an institute that would have far-reaching effects in the water industry. And it wasn't very popular at that time to do that. And she was also interested in creating the well field that exists in Irvine today. And in many cases, she had to threaten to sue the local water districts in order to get that put into place. In hindsight, of course, now it ends up being a brilliant idea. But Ron was always extremely supportive of it and was a great mentor in getting this great institute off. This picture of my mother in 2000. And then we have the two Joans. My mother always really liked the fact that one of the recipients had her name. One of the little later classes of the prize winners. And then Jeff Mosier. As everybody knows in the room, Jeff was the second director of the Institute, and he, in a way, took it to another level and broadened the base and broadened the ability to get the word out about what was happening, and also to interact with the other agencies within the county and within the state. And so we were sorry to see Jeff go, but of course now we're really excited about having Kevin involved. But during his tenure, he did an incredible job for us. another class picture, a later class picture, and then of course to catch everybody up, we also have the class of 2016. But I thought it would be beneficial for people to understand where the prize came from. There's a lot of times you hear about prizes, you always kind of wonder why are they named about individuals. My grandmother had an incredible life. She was able to, I think, influence what happened in the county. She obviously influenced what happened with a number of people. She had really unique experiences, one of which took place within about a mile from here. When Michelson wanted to actually finite his speed of light theory, he persuaded the ranch to allow him to have a piece of property, and the property had to be totally flat. And so they built a mile-long tube, and when he had everything perfected and he was going to announce it to the public, he invited my grandfather to come and be part of the viewing. Well, my grandmother actually went along with him, and since she was the only woman present, she actually was the first person to watch the experiment take place. But she was involved not only in the water, she was involved in agriculture, she was involved in medical schools, law schools. She supported 3 different law schools, and was heavily committed to education and also to science. So thank you for your attention.